So a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about book fans taking just a little bit too far. And this week, we're back to the norm, which is authors kind of just being terrible to reviewers/fans. I've discussed appropriate author-reviewer interaction multiple times now, and I'm going to link a video over here in case you're wondering, but the TLDR is authors should not respond to reviews. Truly, an author should not interact with a review in any way, and they should not interact with a reviewer based off of that person's review. Reviews are not for authors. They're for other readers. If you can read and do something positive with that, great, but it should not in any way, shape, or form involve the reviewer to do that. This drama is a bit more niche than the last one, so I am going to give like a little bit of a point-by-point summary about what happened and also link to other creators' videos who have gone into more detail. Do not go and spread hate to anyone involved. Just because one person does something that you don't think is right doesn't give you the right to go and harass them back. The only goal I have here is for us to have a discussion about what we think are appropriate interactions and maybe what we as a community can do going forward. So let's go ahead and hit the events. Reviewer Haley Hughes read Roll the Dice by Matt Shaw and ended up reviewing it in her worst books of 2022. So then author Matt Shaw writes and publishes Moist Gusset in March 8th of 2023 according to Goodreads stats. This book is supposed to be a satire of a man writing sex scenes from a woman's perspective. He dedicates it to Haley. In this dedication, he calls Haley a supremacist and also a trout, which as far as I can tell from Britannica.com is British slang for like an uptight, curmudgeonly old lady. And there's really no good place for me to insert this into the video, but if you look at the dedication itself, and several other videos I'll have linked below have it screenshotted, it's all like right aligned. And that just makes me feel entirely gross and disgusted to start. There's good use of right alignment for some things in writing, but generally speaking, when people like right align works, especially when it's like a paragraph letter style like dedication, it just makes me think they're being edgy and stupid and pretentious. I'm not saying any of those things are necessarily true, but it is an immediate ick emotional reaction I have to seeing stuff written like that. And I want to just pause here and ask you guys in the comments down below, is there any kind of specific formatting quirks that make you feel immediately grossed out, turned off to a work? And if so, let me know what they are in those comments. This past August the 19th, Haley Hughes and Aspen end up doing a two-part conversation about extreme horror. Part one is like the negatives of extreme horror, and part two is all the things they love about extreme horror and a bunch of book recommendations and author recommendations based off their reading experiences. Haley Hughes details a situation where she gave a 3.5-star review and was getting like death threats and her picture mutilated in kinds of ways and memed out by different other authors and also by their fans. And the other thing that might be relevant here is that the ladies do call out specifically Matt Shaw and one of his books as like an example of books that shouldn't exist at all. No one's talking about part two, which is the positive side of extreme horror, all the things they like and all of the recommendations they made. But honestly, guys, I think that's the better part of the two-part conversation, and I think it should have been first and then the negative should have been second. But anyways, this conversation led to Haley finding out about Moist Gusset by Matt Shaw, and she goes to Goodreads to one-star this one book specifically because it was dedicated to her, which kind of like implies that while he was writing these skeevy, gross, satirical sex scenes from the women's perspective, that he was like thinking about her in some way or like intending this to be her, which is unnerving, gross, upsetting. And more than like the review itself, she just wanted a platform where the book was being sold to like acknowledge she knows about it and that other people should know that that's the case going in. Now that we've got the timeline, let's hit some obvious shit we need to get out of the way. In general, don't review bomb a book. In a sane world, I would have an issue with the review Haley left on Moist Gusset. I don't think if you've never read any part of a book, or if you've never watched any part of the movie or the TV show or whatever the entertainment is, you should one-star it because you don't like the creators or you don't like the politics of the creators or whatever. I think that's just like a bad way to go and a slippery slope. However, in Haley's situation, leaving the 1 star because this book is dedicated to her feels like a valid reason to 1 star something. And I don't know another way for her to express that like that was not something she wanted, not something she was okay with, and tainted the book as a whole. So then, obvious thing number 2, do not write a fictional book about a real person where you either sexualize them or you do harm to them. So I know real person fan fiction is a thing, and I know it includes a subgenre of extreme horror within it. Generally, I think it's wrong when people write this and post it for others to read for free, and I think it's despicable and fucked up when people publish this and sell it for money. Even in this take, there is some nuance you could apply to it. For example, I really like Abraham Lincoln the Vampire Hunter, and I accept that there's a bunch of fictionalized elements of World War II that use actual generals and other people in their fictionalized story. But I mean, something I would say about those 2 examples of acceptable use of real life people in fictionalized situations is those people are dead, as are their loved ones, family, those who knew them, mostly past. And I think that's like a good starting point. Like, would your depiction of this person upset friends, family, victims, anything like that? And if that's the case, then maybe it's not appropriate yet for you to do that fictionalized take. Certainly in this case, Haley Hughes is alive and for all intents and purposes a private citizen, so it's particularly weird and creepy to single her out. Also, it's not like Haley Hughes is the only person ever in her life have given Matt Shaw a negative review. As an extreme horror author, he gets a lot of negative reviews, and a lot of them are similar to the one that Haley gave him. So it just comes across as like strange, oddly obsessed for him to like pull this one review from this one woman and single her out to write a book and dedicate it to her. And you know, honestly, if you can't see how doing this is intimidating, if you can't see how it might encourage your audience to go after that reviewer, if you can't see how this might silence other reviewers of your books or books like them, if you can't see how inappropriate and out of proportion this response is, I really can't help you. I know for writers, it's common to use inspiration from real life, or maybe like to write things out as a form of catharsis or whatever, but you do not keep acknowledgement to real life people in your fictionalized work. That's kind of gross. Like, if Matt Shaw had legitimately just been super upset by Haley Hughes' review and had plucked one element out of the review as a story idea for Moist Gusset and written Moist Gusset and then just not done the dedication, there would be no drama here. And he like continues to publicize her, push her name forward, and encourage other people to go and harass her and do similar things. And that's where the problem lies. Having a dedication in a book like this sort of like smacks of someone trying to like win in debate or whatever. And in doing something like this, singling out a young female reviewer from a host of negative reviews you have and using them in this way, it actually does the opposite and like upholds or claims that there's some kind of misogyny at play in your writing and mindset. So now that we've hit all the obvious stuff, I feel like obligated to say, let's talk about like the nuances I'm actually interested in having a conversation about. Starting with the extreme horror conversation that Haley and Aspen hosted. Cards on the table, I agree with most of the points that Haley and Aspen made, but there were some elements I didn't 100% agree with, and here are a couple of more nuanced quibbles I'd like to bring up. So Haley mentions at one point in time that no other genre has the issues extreme horror has, or has issues even kind of similar to them. And I just think that this showcases a lack of experience in the internet and in this space as a whole. Because while I can't speak for all genres everywhere, I can say that both fantasy and science fiction do have issues of misogyny, racism, and ableism in their books. One example I can give is as a smaller independent author, I'm in a lot of writing communities. But I was in this one Facebook writing community where a person was posting to vent about feedback their beta reader had given them on their epic fantasy. Basically, they'd said like, like there should be some more diversity of the characters in their fantasy world than they were seeing, and that they would prefer it. And the fantasy writer was talking about how there would be a ton of diversity in their fantasy world when they got to book 3 and they got to those parts of the land. Obviously, because of the land and the history and where they were basing it off of, there just wasn't diversity at that time period. Myself and a couple other people disagreed with them, stating a couple of things. Number one, it's a fantasy world. Even if you're basing it off of a real life place, you can do literally anything you want if you wanted to go the colorblind casting route. And that's generally accepted at this point in time. It's not something that's that big a deal for most readers. Number two, there usually was diversity even in a historical period in a historical time. In fact, if you're close enough to another land that you're going to hit it in book 3, unless they're making first contact with that society, there's probably some cross-pollination between those two places already, and you probably should naturally already have a more diverse cast. While there was like a small group of us sort of like saying these things and pointing it out, there was a much louder group of people who were saying like, you're right, and how dare they tell you what to do, and it's your book, and you do whatever you want, and these are the PC police, and rah 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 rah. And this was happening like back in 2010, well before like the woke culture wars we're facing now, which of course you could like peel those off and see that there's a lot of feedback and pushback and angry fans on both sides based off of that as well in fantasy and science fiction. Also, both fantasy and science fiction historically have had a label as white people stuff, and it's something that like the movement is still trying to break out of and diversify now, and we're just starting to see significant improvement there. And both fantasy and science fiction as genres are significantly more established than extreme horror, so it makes sense to me that extreme horror is having some of these issues. And if you want to talk specifically about like the misogyny that's in extreme horror and compare it to fantasy and science fiction, we are consistently going through like, what can a woman realistically do in fighting scenarios? What is their like rightful place? Is this a good depiction even if they're a strong fighter chick, or is this depiction like a man that's just been gender swapped to be a woman for clout? Like, this is all conversations, fodder, stuff that we face, and it's always going to be in all of these book circles, I think, because it's something that we're dealing in our larger society. Didn't find this critique particularly helpful, and I also felt like it probably put some folks in the extreme horror community like on the defensive to start. And again, Haley talks about a specific situation where she had some horrific harassment over a review. And I want to be clear, no one should ever be harassed over a review for any reason, and what happened to her was not okay. But she does talk about how she feels it only happened to her in the extreme because it was an extreme horror book, and that people generally do not respond to reviews. While I think we as a community have been striving to make it the accepted standard that you don't respond to book reviewers and that you don't send people after them or do mean things, that is not the standard currently within our social media group. Even I, as like a super small channel, have gotten authors talking to me about my reviews, and it has been positive, nice things. I haven't felt threatened or concerned, right? And at the time that I was receiving some of these, I had like less than 50 subs and was getting thank you for the review kind of stuff. But like, we know that other people are consistently harassed by independent authors, and we know that they've gone to further extremes than this particular case we're looking at now. Happens all the time. It's part of why we have this conversation all the time. And I really think specifically when Haley called out a lot of big name authors who wouldn't do this, she wasn't really considering the difference between a smaller independent author and a big name author. And the person I'm going to use here is Cassandra Clare. As a larger name author, I don't feel like Cassandra Clare probably responds to a lot of reviewers or critiques nowadays, but she did start off in Harry Potter fan fiction, and when she did that, she was full into the bullying, campaigning, pushing some people out while uplifting other platforms, having rude responses, just doing all kinds of wild and incredible stuff, which has been pretty well documented, and I'll try to find and link a couple videos in case you want more information on it. The point is, when Cassandra Clare was an independent, like, creator that was more directly tied to the community and reliant on them, she was more likely to engage in bullying, responding back to people, being nasty and mean directly. I think for the most part she doesn't do that now as a larger author, and I don't know if that's because she doesn't feel she has to, if it's because she has a team that, you know, keeps her from doing that. Like, I don't know exactly what the mix is, but I know that there's a difference between an independent author and a large author. And then lastly, Haley and Aspen single out Hub by Matt Shaw as a book that just shouldn't exist at all. And I've listened to this particular part of the episode a couple of times now, and I don't understand what argument they're making. As far as I can understand, Hub is a book about an orphanage that trains children for abuse and then sends them to places to be abused. Aspen felt that the book was basically torture porn, and because the characters that were being tortured were minors, that makes this CP. Obviously, I haven't read the book, so I couldn't tell you whether or not I would interpret those scenes as ones that were meant to excite. I don't necessarily think that's what people mean when they call something torture porn or gore porn. They're just saying that there's like a celebration of the violent in it, not necessarily that that stuff is there to excite people. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Someone can correct me in the comments if I am. But because I haven't read the book and I don't know the nuance or the dynamics, I just don't feel like I can weigh in on that part of the conversation. And it seems like the second point they have against Hub is that Aspen read this book and she was hurt in it in a deep and personal way that it's still difficult for her to talk about. And I want to go ahead and say that that's awful. I feel terrible that Aspen had that experience. Go to something that's supposed to be like an escape and fun and comforting and maybe cathartic, and you find that it is upsetting and grotesque and just like the worst than the life around you that you might have wanted an escape from. That just sucks and it doesn't feel good, and I want to stand by her feelings on that point. However, just because she felt that way about the book doesn't mean the book shouldn't exist. And it doesn't mean that everybody feels that way or that people who feel differently than her are wrong. I respect her personal experience. I appreciate that she stood up and shared it. I think it might have been important in like a reviewing space or like in a talking to her audience specifically who might also feel similarly to her to like have shared that moment. But that's not really the same as stopping a book from existing or from saying that nobody needs, wants, or could enjoy this book for some other kind of reason. And while both Haley and Aspen focus on Hub specifically as like an example of extreme horror going too far, they are talking about it in the context of this being a larger trend of extreme horror trying to like one up the other book and like continuing to focus on like younger victims, more female victims, and more like essay and violence than there was before, which I'm sure is an aspect of the genre. But instead of focusing on one individual author and one individual book, I would have really liked it if they could have like shown how this was a trend with increasing violence and then like elaborated why this trend was bad. Because as it stands right now in this conversation, I just kind of have to take their word for it that this is true. And I've dabbled a little bit in extreme horror, and this has not been my experience with it as of now. I'm not saying they're wrong. I don't know. I don't have any data points, but it just seems like we're talking about nothing because they didn't give me anything really to start off with except this one book over here we didn't like. I had two main takeaways. Extreme horror is growing right now as a genre, and there's two main types of readers. One reader is there specifically for the gore, the gross factor, and the other group wants like those extreme things to mean something within the narrative, and if it's just extremeness for the extreme sake, they don't necessarily find value in that. And I think Haley and Aspen are in this latter category where like they enjoy reading extreme horror and extreme things happening in their fiction, but they want it to be for like a larger purpose or a larger thematic point or like a larger character growth or development than they're getting in some of these novels. Because it feels like there's probably space for both of these groups to exist within the extreme horror genre, and there's probably fairly significant overlap in several books. We should just be talking about like how we interact with each other. And like on the I want it to one up itself, I want it to be grosser and more intense and just more every time side of things, that's cool, 100% do you. But then don't go after people who didn't like the book because that's all it was doing. You know, like just acknowledge that's what it is and that's fine. And on the other side, people whose critique is like, I want a point or meaning or reason for this to be happening, that's fine, but leave people who just want to see the gore alone too. And a little bit this conversation between Haley and Aspen, like from my perspective, it seems like they were trying to explain why these people were wrong. Really not their place place, like as long as people are reading and not hurting anyone who really cares what they're doing. All right, and then next we do have to talk a little bit more about Matt Shaw. So I've never read anything by him, but both Dolphin and Funhouse were on my TBR list. And I really wanted to read Dolphin. It sounded like a really fun time. Even after this Haley and Matt stuff came out, I was thinking about how maybe I could still read Dolphin and do like an in-depth review on it, comparing its pros and seeing if there was any inherent misogyny in a extreme horror story that's about a dolphin attacking people versus like an extreme horror that might have more essay and other things that are inherently like violence against women. And in the end, I decided to scrap this idea and decided that I personally wasn't going to be reading any Matt Shaw or doing any promotion of his writing on my channel, specifically after I looked at a deep dive of some of his other stuff, so it wasn't just this one Matt Shaw-Haley interaction. I wanted to share some of those other things that are going on in Matt Shaw's bio in the most charitable way I can, just so that you're fully informed. If you want to keep reading this author, if you want to start reading this author, you know, you do you, but this is what's going on there. So first red flag to me is he's got like some kind of weird obsession about Amber Heard. And like my hot take on the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial situation, we don't really know what happened in their relationship. We're just like outsiders with messy details about it, right? And I feel like anyone who talks about this for too long or who takes a side on either side, whether you're pro Johnny Depp, they're pro Amber Heard, you're weird, okay? And you're off-putting, and I don't like it. But Matt Shaw kind of like takes this to the next level because he wrote a torture novel where he named the main character Amber and says directly that it's meant to be Amber Heard getting like tortured for, I guess, what she did to Johnny Depp. I don't know. And the other thing is he like continually calls women he doesn't like by Amber as a name, and that's weird too, like to be so obsessed. And like this is the hill, you know, like if you want to take men's side when they're been wronged or whatever, great. And if you want to do like a man versus woman thing for whatever reasons, fine. But it just seems very strange on this subject where I think everything is so messy. This is the clear-cut example you decide to stand up for. So that gave me the super creeps and was probably enough all on its own for me to decide never to engage with this person again. But I do want to be fair because in his catalog of stories, he also has a book that's called Matt Shaw is Dead, where he talks about his own demise, torture, and somehow supernatural existence just to continue to write stories for his fans. And the book itself sounds pretty fun and campy. It sounds like a guy with a good sense of humor, who's a little bit self-depreciating, who wants to reach out and interact with his community in like kind of positive ways, has a little bit of a larger point, maybe not. I don't know, I haven't read the book. But like either way, it's kind of like fun, gory splash, and it sounds like someone who just doesn't take like writing graphic gore about real people that seriously, and who might not understand like that there's a difference between writing about that stuff happening to you versus writing about that stuff happening to somebody else, because like obviously it doesn't bother him. This really could be a case where there's just like a mental disconnect and he doesn't get it, and it's not like a red flag creepy thing going on, even though that's how it comes off. And then lastly, I guess we have to talk about Hub, because there's been so much to do about it. I want to start off by saying that while Hub is not on Amazon, it's not a banned from Amazon book. Like Shaw intentionally made the decision to put Hub only on Etsy to restrict other people's access or exposure to it, because he felt like it was only for a very niche, specific, smaller audience, even within his niche community. And part of the reason I think this is so important to bring up is because one of the few things that Matt Shaw seems to agree with Haley and Aspen about, having extreme horror in bookstores could be problematic, and having people find this material or read this material when they're not prepared for it is probably a bad thing. So like the way that Haley and Aspen had this conversation and singled out Hub and didn't call out this specific fact about it, like kind of meant that they didn't have an opportunity to have this common ground and conversation with Shaw that they could have otherwise had, because it does seem like there's some kind of line there, there's some kind of something there that Shaw wants to present or give out, and that Haley and Aspen would probably agree with him. I think it's a shame we missed that opportunity to have that conversation. It seems like most reviewers are comparing the events happening in the book to like stuff you might read in true crime, and like the book loosely being based off of crimes that have happened before. Matt Shaw himself sort of says, like, if you've ever wondered where all those children come from who are victims of true crime, it's this hub here. And I have to say, the premise itself to me sounds super bland and uninteresting. I have never once in my life wondered where bad people get a hold of children to do bad things to. There are children in the foster care system, in the adoption system, just wandering around. A lot of children out there are very easy pickings for predators, and we don't need to create like an imaginary orphanage that's like training kids up to accept this for people to be bad. This isn't a horror scenario or like a scary bad story, but I am gonna link a video for your information to this woman, Liz Hunter, who is self-describing her own adoption, foster care system, and eventual experience with rehoming. And her story is truly terrifying, specifically because there was no adult legally responsible for her for years. And she didn't even know this until she got to college. And there's a similar situation going on with, I think she says, her sister, where they tried to enroll her into high school and there was no one who was her legal guardian and therefore able to enroll her in high school. Which, like, what did that even mean? Did that mean she couldn't go to high school? Did that mean she couldn't go to that high school? And how does that sit there like that? Like, is there a process for the adults who are taking care of her to become her guardian? Is there a way to prove that the other guardian abandoned her? How do we find out who her last guardian was? Like, all that stuff is how kids get lost in the system and is truly scary and terrifying and is something that we as a society should be doing something about. And that's the part to me that's really horrific. Not so much that like bad things are happening to children, but that there's a whole system failing the children and enabling that sort of thing to happen. So I just sort of feel like Matt Shaw focused on like the gore exhibitionist aspect of the problem, but never really delve into the part that to me would have been really scary and would have had like purpose or whatever, which is why this kind of story doesn't appeal to me. Additionally, a lot of the elements that were extreme horror in this scenario sounded very similar to stuff that I have read about or listened to when we're discussing like ritual satanic abuse of children or people who've experienced ritual satanic abuse. It wasn't like necessarily unrealistic in that way. Now, ritual satanic abuse and like recovered memories of this is a controversial topic where it seems like some people were influenced and don't actually have true memories, and other people might have actually recovered real memories, and it's a whole issue that I don't want to get into. Where I'm going with this is that there is this group of like QAnon conspiracy theorists that believe there's like a bunch of elites that are abusing children and like passing them around in this way. So writing literature that's reminiscent of this or that kind of like reinforces this idea in any way, in any genre, feels just a little bit irresponsible to me and might be something I would potentially critique the book for if I had read it. The allegations of CP against Hub and similar kinds of extreme horror, I really don't have anything to comment on one way or the other. I'm listening to those kind of videos, I'm looking to learn, further educate myself, and hear people out on where they stand with it. But like personally, I just don't hold an opinion on it or like any kind of strong feelings, I guess, one way or the other. So wrapping this all up, authors, please, please, please do not interact with reviewers. If you struggle with that, maybe don't even read the review. And reviewers, please be careful about making claims about the author versus claims about the work. One point in the we need to talk about extreme horror element that Haley and Aspen get into is the difference between an authorial voice and like themes within the book. And I think they do a great job explaining the difference between those two things and how you might come to realize that there's like an unconscious bias towards misogyny in the work that's not intentional and might be something the author held. But one of the points that they bring up even when discussing this in this conversation is you would get that through reading multiple works by that author and seeing it continually crop up. Each person brings their own life experience and they experience unconscious bias on different things because of who they are, which might illuminate an unconscious bias an author or a genre has. And that's definitely like a super interesting conversation and I think is worth following up on, but it is something you'd need many examples of, maybe multiple works across a genre if you're saying the genre has the issue, or multiple works in an author's wheelhouse. And in this specific conversation that Haley and Aspen had, while they did imply that both Shaw and I believe Duncan Ralston had issues with misogyny and racism in their work, they only focused in on like one specific work to prove this point, which sort of goes against the whole thread of a voice would be something you'd find in multiple parts of work. So I would have just loved if they could have brought up some more examples. And that's really it for now on this situation. I know that there's been like some ongoing back and forth in Twitter that I haven't covered, and some of the videos below will give you more information on that. And I know that Haley Hughes intends to respond to the whole controversy in video format probably later in September, it sounds like, but this is where I am right now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you like these kind of detailed breakdowns and like explorations of a couple of topics that are brought to my mind that don't necessarily have to do with the main issue at hand. If you got to the end of this video, comment down below with like a skull emoji or a pen emoji. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep reading. Bye!